Thank you. There's an author called William Gibson who once said, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And I think that's a great quote. And I think he probably was thinking about Korea when he wrote that. I'm very happy and thankful to have been invited here. I always like coming to Seoul. It's where the future is in terms of technology, certainly. And I only have 20 minutes today, so I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to give a very sort of high-level, superficial presentation of my thoughts on the future of financial services and financial technology. I'm going to talk about three things. First, as a bit of background, our underlying thesis about the change in our economic and social paradigms. Then I'm going to give a short overview, introduction to what I'd call information age finance 1.0, and look at the business models and maybe a few of the companies that are starting to emerge and drive this new paradigm. And then I'm going to finish with a look at a day in the life of a person in 2034, 20 years from now. What will financial services look like? So without any further ado, we look at the world through a prism of big economic and cultural epochs or ages. The first one of the modern man, was the feudal agrarian economy. And this lasted for thousands of years, probably up until the late 1700s or 1800s, when we had the Industrial Revolution. And we saw the industrial economy come into play. And that's the economy that we've grown up in all of our lives and really came to the fore and reached its apogee in the late 20th century. Post-war, with the business models, the companies, the political, social, industrial organization that was optimized after we learned over 250 years how to deal with this industrial economy. And in this world, the optimal business model, or the optimal approach to business was that companies were focused on economies of scale, and the customer revolved around the company. Company management was focused on efficiency and providing products and services, and in a mass market typically, and the customer consumed those services. More recently, and I think we're just living the beginning of this, or maybe we have been for sort of maybe 10 or 15 years, so it's maybe the end of the beginning, we've entered the information economy. And this is driving a very, very fundamental change in all of our economy, of course, but also our society, and our institutions and our culture probably lag. I mean, humans aren't very good at adapting at the same speed, at exponential speed, as technology and economies are changing. So I think some of the dislocations that we're seeing around the world today, whether it's in financial markets, social dislocations, is our difficulty as societies in adapting to this new world. But we have the millennials, we have Generation Y, they have been born into this new world, and I think we'll see over the next 10 or 20 years as they come into their maturity, into middle life, that these paradigms of the information age will become ubiquitous, and our institutions will adapt painfully and slowly, but this change is coming. And in the context of companies, and you'll hear this over and over again, in the information age, the economy revolves around the customer. And companies need to have enormous empathy with and exist to provide value to their customers, not the other way around. And a lot of the challenges of the leading incumbent businesses of the industrial age, a lot of the challenges they're facing is they weren't built to deal with a world like this. So I won't go through this line by line in 20 minutes, but this is a good summary of some of the key differences between the industrial age and the information age. The industrial age was a consumerist age. It was about industrial production, mass production, economies of scale. The optimal business models typically were vertically integrated because transaction and information costs were high. The focus, as I said earlier, was on management was focused on delivering products and services, and organizational structures were very much hierarchical. That was the optimal way to organize ourselves. In the information age, a lot of these have changed. The world is very uncertain, change happens at an exponential rate. A key success factor, and we say this over and over again to the companies that we advise, is you need to optimize for resilience, not for scale. Resilience to change. It needs to be deep in your DNA, and this is a big advantage that startups have because they start with a blank sheet of paper. They can build their companies that way, much as Ford built Ford in a way that was optimized for the industrial economy in the early 20th century. So, moving on to Information Age Finance 1.0. What does that mean? Well, the financial services industry is an industry that is potentially ideally suited to move into the information age from the industrial age. Why do I say that? Because finance is all about not data, zeros and ones. Unlike, let's say, Amazon or Samsung, you don't need to ship physical goods anywhere. Already today, and for many, many years already, finance has become dematerialized. There's no longer stock certificates going around. Even cash, even though cash still exists, is important, as a percentage of the overall financial economy is very small. So what we're dealing with is zeros and ones. And so it should be obvious that finance should have been perhaps at the vanguard of some of these changes of business models from the industrial era to the information era. That hasn't been the case, and there's some very good reasons for that. There are fairly obvious reasons. One is financial services. This is going to be a tautology, very obvious, is dealing with people's money. So the inertia that people have, rightfully so, in moving their behaviors in financial services is much higher, but it's not infinite. Related to that, and because of that, financial services is a highly regulated industry. So again, the interface between what's possible economically or technologically and what is possible from a social institutional perspective, i.e. a regulatory perspective, isn't always immediately apparent. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, hopefully, if I have time, about the importance of regulation and perhaps some of the things that we can do to adapt and enhance this movement. So financial services has been a little bit of a late comer to this move from the industrial age to the information age, but as we've all seen, and as some of our introductory speakers said this morning, it's picking up pace, and we're at the end of the beginning, perhaps, and the beginning of big change, because all the ingredients are there for it naturally to evolve in this way. And I think the global financial crisis of 2008 was perhaps marked a catalyst or a turning point where, like a supertanker, the movement at first is very slow, but the direction of the industry was changed by that outcome. That was sort of the end of the industrial era of financial services, and the very beginnings, the seeds were planted for a revolution in financial services business models. So, again, using the same sort of framework, what's the difference between industrial age and information age financial services? Well, culture is very important. So financial services, like the industries that they were supporting in the 20th century, was very focused on consumption, on stable, steady life cycles. And even today, you know, you're born, you go to school, you get a job, you have children, you buy a house, you retire, you die. And everybody's path is very linear. And there was a lot of commonality. Certainly in Western or developed markets, you could take a very sort of statistical Gaussian approach to the market. Everybody was the same. We're moving into a world where that's unlikely to be the case going forward. So there's going to be a lot more variability, a lot more volatility in people's life paths. We were moving from a world where physical resources were abundant to one where they're scarce, and vice versa, where informational resources were very expensive and scarce, and now they're abundant. And I'm always reminded of, I started my career as a bond trader, and when I started that job in 1990, walking onto a trading floor of a major investment bank as a bond trader, you were, as Tom Wolfe said, a master of the universe. You had access to information that was at least an order of magnitude, if not 2 orders of magnitude higher than anyone in the general population. As little as 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, I remember buying my son his first computer. He was 7 years old for his birthday, and sitting in his room, setting it up, hooking it up to the internet, and sort of having this epiphany moment that this 7-year-old sitting in a bedroom in London had access to the kind of information, not that he was looking up that kind of information, but he had access to that information from his bedroom that only somebody in the canyons of Wall Street or in the city of London had as little as 10 or 15 years earlier. So the world is changing fundamentally. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are some of these names you may have seen, some perhaps not, but we're seeing these new startups arising in every area of financial services. And some of them have grown to be quite big, even though in the context of financial services, even the biggest ones are still minnows. Companies like Lending Club, Stripe, and others. But you have thousands of others. There's a Cambrian explosion of startups in the financial services space over the last 2 to 3 years. We started Anthemis about 6 or 7 years ago to invest in this space and help catalyze this space. And it's been very, very encouraging to see, as I said, in the last 2 or 3 years, it start to take off. I'm going to go through very briefly a couple examples just to give you a flavor. Movin is an application, a personal banking application essentially, that helps you manage your financial health. Right? It's not about budgeting, it's about helping you make decisions in real time about what you spend and how you spend it. And the key there, I think, is real time. The key enabling technology for this is the mobile phone or the smartphone, because unlike a historical budgeting application, what's important is at the moment when you're going to make a financial decision, should I buy this cup of coffee? Should I take a taxi or take the bus? Should I buy these new shoes? You need to have that information in real time. Can I afford it? If I do this action, what other actions do I need to not, how will that restrict me going forward? So real-time financial intelligence. Payoff is a company in the alternative credit or lending space. I guess a competitor to Lending Club in some ways, but it's an enormous space. But here they're focused very much, again, on using the power of big data, psychometrics, to provide a more holistic service to their customers in terms of helping them not only get credit, but understand how that credit relates to their overall balance sheet. And if they aren't eligible for credit, instead of just rejecting them and sending them away, helping them, putting them into a program, a little bit maybe like Weight Watchers, what steps can I take that will allow me to access credit in the future? The third company I think is very, very interesting. All these companies, these last 3 companies that I've talked about, just as a disclaimer, Anthemis is an investor, but there are many, many others, but I'm talking about these, I know them best. Trove is a company that helps you manage your tangible wealth. What does tangible wealth mean? Your non-financial assets, cars, jewelry, art, furniture, property. And for most people in most countries around the world, this is a very, very significant part of their balance sheet, and yet all the focus has been historically on managing financial assets. Trove, again, uses technology to allow you very simply to inventory, manage, insure, sell, optimize, finance your financial assets, giving you access to unlocking your total personal balance sheet. So what might the world look like in 20 years? Well, meet Henry Case. He's 10 years old today, so these are people that exist. These are our sons and daughters. They exist today. In 2034, they'll be 30 years old. They probably, again, in developed countries at least, 8, 9, 10 years old, getting their first tablet computers, learning Minecraft, discovering the world through YouTube. Any question, how do you do this? The first place you go is YouTube. Oftentimes have a phone more and more often. So they've grown up as truly digital natives. They have known no other world. They're going to graduate in high school in a few years. Their career paths, their educational paths will start to look different than ours. Probably not completely different yet. Maybe that's another 20 or 30 years away. But they're going to grow up in a different world. So these are real people. This is a far future. 20 years is a long time, but it's not. This is something that's tangible. They're going to live in a world where sensors are ubiquitous, where a world of intelligent agents doing their bidding, Algorithms, again, ubiquitous, invisible probably, but running everything. Virtual reality and meat space, as they say, will start blending more and more. The distinction will be less and less real. A world of not just big data, but gigantic, enormous, unimaginable data. A world where I think cryptography will become increasingly important, and that will become a base technology driving a lot of businesses and our life in real time. And it will be very adaptive. The products and services will adapt to this, coming back to this idea that change is accelerating and we need to be resilient. Not only companies or businesses, but people will need to be resilient and adaptive to change. And that's part of the DNA that will be different of, you know, Henry Case, the 30-year-old in 2034, but certainly his children. And a world of synthetic or artificial intelligence. Something that, this is a bit speculative, well, I guess all of this is speculative, but I think the personal blockchains might become very important over the next 20 years. Because one of the issues that faces us today and will continue to face us in the future is issues of identity, trust, and security, and navigating this completely algorithmic, gigantic data world. And you know, this idea of a personal blockchain, we've invested in a company called Eris Industries that's building a developer platform, a set of tools that allow anyone to build a blockchain. And the idea here would be, perhaps in 20 years' time, each individual has their own blockchain, which describes all the transactions in their life. I mean, this is literally millions of transactions that it's captured in a blockchain that's cryptographically secure and that allows them to interact as a digital agent in the world that they live in. So that's just, you know, food for thought. The other big idea I think we'll start seeing in 30 years, and I don't think it'll ever be called this, but I don't have a better language to describe it. PALM, what does that stand for? It stands for Personal Asset Liability Management. Now, asset liability management is something that if you're a banker, if you're a bond trader, you know, I grew up for 20 years thinking about asset liability management. It's not something that anyone day to day outside of that world thinks about or even knows about or would even understand if you said asset liability management. But I think it's fundamentally important to financial services. That's what financial services are about. Even if it's not described that, just the same way as I have no idea how the graphics chip on my iPhone works. I don't need to know how it works. It just does, and I know it allows me to do many, many things with that device. Personal asset liability management is something that I don't think anyone in 30 years or 20 years will know what that is, but they will be living that. The financial services industry of 2034 will provide real-time, optimized personal asset liability management. Looking at your assets, you know, today, which is basically your current accounting, your current spending management. Tomorrow, which is, you know, would be called wealth management, looking at your assets for future consumption, your savings, and how you build that. But also looking at the other side of the balance sheet, which is your liabilities. You know, current capital, your liabilities, current liabilities, capital needs, working capital needs, short-term cash flow needs, and longer-term liabilities, mortgages, investment in education, investments in your life. And this world is the opportunity and the challenge facing financial services over the next 20 years. I think, you know, it'll be a combination of some of the leading incumbents today that will be nimble enough to reinvent themselves over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Some will disappear, those that aren't nimble. But also a whole universe of emerging startups, some that maybe exist today, many, many others who don't exist yet and will only come into existence in the next decade or two, that will allow Henry to live his life day to day with optimal asset liability management, managing all of his ideas. Sort of think of Siri, when you ask Siri, where should I eat tonight? It will be asking, should I do this financially? Should I make this investment? Should I make this purchase? Should I take this risk? But all of that will be almost invisible. I'm not sure through what device that might happen. So if we're living today, that would be through the smartphone or some sort of similar devices. I think in 20 years' time, it could well be something different. It could be wearables. It could actually even be integrated. Who knows? That's sort of beyond my pay grade to speculate about that, but I think it will be there. So just to wrap up, the key takeaways, I think, for this group is that ecosystems are vitally important. I don't think any company or individual or groups of individuals will be able to survive in this fast-changing world alone. You need to be part of an ecosystem. The capital is important. We need to invest in this future today if we want to play a part in it. And so ecosystems and capital, that's a lot of collaboration between existing leaders in the industry today and the future leaders and the future collaborators. And then the last thing I'll say before wrapping up is regulation. Just to touch on very quickly, I think the regulators have a great role to play in helping this future to develop. I could talk, and I have talked about that for hours separately, but the key takeaway on regulation is that, and we've been discussing this with UK regulators, with US regulators, is creating parallel startup regulatory frameworks instead of trying to replace the existing regulatory frameworks, which are very complex and mostly very useful and helpful for the existing industry. Just as a startup doesn't replace an existing incumbent overnight, but exists in parallel and grows in parallel, I think there's a fantastic opportunity for individual national regulators and global regulators to create regulatory sandboxes that are built from a blank sheet of paper with the same principles but are adapted to this new world. And that one day, maybe in 10 or 15 or 20 years, may replace today's rules, but I think you need to run those two regimes in parallel. So again, that was a very high-level, fast overview. I hope it was helpful, and thank you very much.
션팍이 그려준 미래의 그림이 굉장히 기대되고요. 그리고 레귤레이션이나 좀 더 자세한 내용에 대해서는 대담 중에 더 여쭤보도록 하겠습니다. 두 번째 모실 키노트 스피커는 조지 월너인데요. 그는 지급 결제 분야에서 선구자이자 또 혁신가입니다. 국내에서는 최근 삼성페이 인수된 루페이 창업자로 알려져 있지만 사실 1978년에 이미 하이퍼컴이라는 지급 결제 시스템을 설립해서 최초의 매그네틱 스트립 기반의 POS 터미널들을 지금 현재 우리가 보는 모습으로 구현해낸 분이십니다. 그래서 글로벌 선두 기업으로 이끌어내셨고 지금은 이제 연속 창업가로서의 길을 계속해 나가고 계십니다. 반갑게 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. You know, I go to conferences just like you, and I'm hoping to hear from somebody what's going to happen in the future. And we get a lot of people who predict the future. It's normally 10 to 15, 20 years out. What you don't hear often is people predicting the future 1 to 5 years out. That's a lot more riskier. So what I would like to do now is take a risk and talk about the future of electronic payments, specifically electronic wallets. There has been a lot of talk and speculation when electronic wallets will be adopted by the public, when consumers widely adopt them and use them for most of their day-to-day payments. One of the key ingredients to this is acceptance. Very simply, your electronic wallet has to work at most of the retailers you go and shop at. And this is really a key challenge because there are many different retail systems. Korea is a very good example. While Europe is mostly dominated by standalone terminals, the Korean retail market is mostly integrated systems, very complex systems that are not easy to replace. And really, acceptance at the point of sale, this is the key point there. Consumers must have a confidence that when they walk into a store, their mobile phone will actually work, that they can complete a payment with their mobile phone. Consumers are not good experimenters. They will not go around and say, I'm going to try it, and if it doesn't work, I use something else. No, consumers must have confidence. The retail environment, however, is complex. It has a lot of inertia. Merchants don't like to spend money, and especially don't like to spend money on things that they don't clearly see an immediate profit or benefit. We estimate that there is a threshold that about 80% of the time your payment method should work before you really, as a consumer, adopt it and start using it seriously. Anything less than 80%, it's basically just an experiment. And if there is no acceptance, if there is this 80% threshold is not reached, you're not going to see adoption. Just simply, it's not going to happen. And while many people came up with great ideas on how to make mobile payments work at the point of sale, they all involved changing the point of sale. And sure, the point of sale has to change, but it's not going to change quickly. It is easier to adapt to it than to force change. Again, it's easier to adapt to what the merchants have today than forcing them to change. I think there are many people who would confirm that. We at Samsung have developed a mobile wallet and a technology that we believe will change that paradigm about adoption. Essentially a system that works both at the existing terminals, at the existing merchant infrastructure, and a future emerging infrastructure. This has been always like that with successful technologies. When your high-definition TV came out, it was able to receive regular broadcast. Of course, there were no high-definition programs. It had to be backwards compatible. USB 2 is backwards compatible with USB 1. Anything else would inconvenience you as a consumer. And if you inconvenience the consumer, there'll be no adoption. Adoption happens when the consumer is confident, is not inconvenienced, and he can see that this product actually works. The Samsung Pay solution is specifically aimed to ensure a very high level of acceptance, using both new and old technology. It uses a mode we call dual mode, which supports a magnetic transmission and a NFC transmission. These two work together seamlessly. Again, the main goal behind them is a seamless, easy acceptance. The technology is not there to resurrect the magnetic stripe card. It's not a technology where we're trying to make the magnetic stripe survive. No, the magnetic stripe is totally obsolete. We repurpose the magnetic stripe reader as a contactless reader. Indeed, what we do is to eliminate the magnetic stripe and replace it with a modern payment method called tokenization. And tokenization is really a huge step for the financial industry. As Sean said before, there is a dematerialization of payments occurring. Tokenization is probably the most important step in that. It will allow the industry to get away from hardware devices, including magnetic stripe cards, including chip cards, get away from the hardware. Samsung Pay works by transmitting tokens, either through a magstripe reader or an NFC reader. It is really just tries to achieve absolute maximum acceptance. Indeed, the consumer doesn't care what is the specific technology that makes his payment work. They definitely care, however, if it doesn't work. So here the goal is make it work. Make it reliable, and of course make it flexible and support many different card schemes, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, but beyond that, private label cards, gift cards, cards that are non-financial cards, because those are important to the retailers. And the retailers are a very important constituency in this whole payment environment. Using Samsung Pay is easy. It's a two-step function. You basically activate the payment function, use your fingerprint to authenticate, and transmit the transaction data. It's very convenient, quick, simple, and secure. And let me talk a little about security. There's been a hell of a lot of news about security. Data breaches, card bases being stolen, cards being skimmed, replicated, etc. So security is a serious issue not only for the card issuers, but also for consumers. Again, it comes back to confidence. So the technology we developed is based on tokenization. It's not the repeat of the magnetic stripe. The magnetic stripe is specifically obsolete because the data on the stripe is static. Magnetic secure transmission transmits a card formatted data. However, the data is static. The static part is a token that is created with a very strong cryptogram. And the idea here is that the token is only usable once. It has a limited lifetime. It can be only used once. Once a token is used, it's essentially worthless. So if anybody copies a token, steals it from a database, it is valueless. It's not worth bothering to get it. Think of it this way. You can either build something very strong to protect something valuable, and I guarantee you that it will be stolen, or you make that thing non-valuable, and I guarantee you it won't be stolen. And that's the idea with replacing card numbers with tokens. Card numbers are valuable. Tokens are not valuable once they're used. So this is a much easier way to achieve good security than trying to build a Fort Knox or some other structure. The security also comes from the fact that we use a fingerprint reader to authenticate the consumer. So even if somebody managed to steal tokens, they would be mostly useless because you don't have a copy of the fingerprint. Samsung also has a program called Knox where we actively monitor the status of the mobile device. We actively looking for signs of hacking or rooting. And again, the right approach to security is not one fantastic layer that is ultra secure. The right approach is to have many layers that all contribute to an overall very strong secure architecture. And Knox plays a very important role in that. The card provisioning, and that is how the card gets loaded into the wallet, has to be secure. So tokens cannot be stolen on the fly. We provide an end-to-end cryptographic envelope for provisioning cards into the wallet. Additionally, we have a secure account and user verification. You heard rumors of a major mobile wallet having security issues where people were able to hijack cards and accounts. Without going into the technical details, they did not have a good system of securing account access. And they made the mistake of using a card number, which is what's called a card not present data, to convert it into a card present card, which is just, it should never be done. So we have a much better system, it's more secure, and we believe that it will reduce the occurrence of fraud very substantially. So now we're getting to the point where really I want to talk to you about the future. And this is really, I think, the most important message I can deliver you today. Ultimately, we are not doing this because we believe that replacing a plastic card with a phone transmission is a big deal for the consumer. What is going to be a big deal is completely replacing a card with a new electronic card. Everybody talks about the Internet of Things, where, for example, your refrigerator is connected to the web, and the power company is managing the refrigerator for optimum power usage and lowest cost. Well, shouldn't a payment card be connected to the card issuer? Shouldn't the card issuer be able to manage such an important instrument where the card is divorced from a physical device and where security is provided through tokenization? It doesn't matter where that new electronic card is. It can be on a phone, it can be on another device, maybe in a wearable, in a watch, or something on your keychain. This is going to be a huge change because with these new purely electronic cards, and I call them cards, but they may not look like cards, card issuers finally will be able to better manage security, better manage new product, introduce new ways of usage. So when we look at this, it's not that the magnetic stripe card is obsolete. No, it is the card that is obsolete. The unconnected, unnetworked card is obsolete. And it's going to be replaced by something connected, always online, flexible. And the ideal platform for that is the mobile phone. Because the mobile phone is always online, always connected, and it is really just the perfect platform for that. Now, do I know what these new payment products will be? Of course I don't. We already have projects where we're experimenting with things, and we can see opportunities. The real way technology improves is that somebody comes up with an enabling technology, and then somebody else comes up with the technology to use that enabling technology to come up with new products, new ways of using it, where essentially the first step must be taken. You cannot go and speculate about the second and the third step. The first step must be taken. And the first step is making a mobile wallet practical and easy to adopt by consumers. And for that, the most important step is make it work with the retail infrastructure. Waiting 2 or 3 years is not realistic. Consumers are not like that. Consumers will not go and try something and say, oh, I really like this. I'm going to wait 3 years before I start using it. That's just not how people work. Something else comes along, their attention is taken somewhere else, and you lose them. You can only make a big entrance once. It better work the first time, and to make it work the first time, it has to work with the existing retail infrastructure. Not because it's the best, but because it is there. It is something you can work with. It's reality. It's not fantasy, it's reality. And that's why we believe that at Samsung Pay, we really have an electronic wallet that works for consumers, works for retailers, and ultimately works for card issuers and the entire payments industry. Thank you.
아직까지 좀 미스테리어스한 삼성페이의 실체에 대해서 조금 더 들을 수 있었던 시간이었고요. 이 두 분을 대상으로 짧게 남은 한 20분간 대담을 진행하겠습니다. 그래서 제가 준비한 질문들이 먼저 있고 이후에 오디언스로부터 이제 관객 청중 여러분들부터 한 질문 하나 정도 받을 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그래서 여러분들께서 꼭 여쭙고 싶은 질문 있으면 준비해 주시기 부탁드릴게요. All right, folks. So as I mentioned, we'll cover some common questionnaire to both of you, followed by a couple specific questions to each. If you have the time, we'll allow the floor to come up with one question. Okay. Sure. So, my first question to both of you revolves around the big theme of the forum today. So investment into fintech has surged in recent years, tripling to $12 billion in last year globally. What is driving this rapid growth? Do you believe fintech has real and imminent potential to fundamentally disrupt existing banks and financial institutions? Sean, would you like to take that? Yep.
Well, yeah. So will it disrupt the existing industry? I think absolutely. And I put my money where my mouth is, and I built a company to help make that happen. But I don't think the existing leading incumbents are going to sort of disappear overnight or be usurped overnight. And I think there is an opportunity for many of them to adapt. Financial services, as I said in my presentation, is a hard industry where it moves slowly for the right reasons, and sometimes often for the wrong reasons as well, but there are reasons why things take time. But this disruption is there. It's going to happen. I think it's inevitable. In terms of investment in the sector, as I said also earlier, it's very encouraging to see the world wake up to this opportunity, an opportunity that we identified over a decade ago that seems sort of obvious to me. Financial services is a digital industry. It should and needs to adapt to this future. $12 billion, it doesn't sound like a very big number to me. I mean, coming back to Andy's talk on China, you need to look at the context of the size of the industry. I've seen a variety of numbers from people like Gartner or McKinsey or what have you, but the size of the financial services industry is measured in the trillions of dollars. I've seen numbers like $4 or $5 or $6 trillion globally. So $12 billion is a drop in the bucket. And particularly in finance, I mean, there's a lot of banks that get fined $12 billion a year in the US. So that doesn't seem like a lot of money to me at all. I think we've only got started. I mean, I think that's going to continue to grow significantly over the next decade.
Do you have anything to add to that?
So there is another aspect to the financial services industry, and that is, as Sean said, it's purely digital, but many of the incumbents derive very large revenues by just simply charging a small percent on every transaction. And everybody is after that.
So I can totally tell that we have somewhat of a biased panel here. We're all very bullish on the disruption that's happening. Going on to the next, a very specific Korean environment question. So Korea's fintech industry is lagging behind its global competition, arguably by 3 to 4 years. Most of the fintech discussions taking place today center around payment. If the industry fails to close this gap, what will the future financial landscape of Korea will look like in, say, 15 years from now?
Let me take that. So, behind what? Look at Europe. In Europe, they adopted EMV smart cards for two very specific reasons. One was to have a payment industry that was not a prisoner of the telecommunications monopolies. Years ago, when the Europeans decided on the EMV smart cards, the main driving factor was to take transactions offline, to be able to conduct a transaction between a consumer and the merchant securely without having to go online. Now the world has changed, that's for sure. Korea always had good communications, and the pressure to do offline transactions was not there, and therefore the need for a chip card-based payment system was simply not there. Banks looked at the security benefits, the reduction in fraud, and compared it to the actual fraud, and I said, why should I pay $3 for a $2 reduction in fraud? It's kind of simple mathematics. So the pressure was not there to change. The pressure is there to change not so much because fraud has gone up a lot, but it became incredibly visible. And it is this optics, this visibility of fraud that is now moving everybody towards smart cards, which is a good move. It's necessary. Is it late? Well, it's late because the technology is 20 years old, so it's late. But I don't think the Korean market is specifically behind, certainly not behind the US market, which will really start its conversion this year, and it's a conversion that will take probably 5 to 6 years, by which time the physical card will be seriously obsolete, by which time we're going to move from a chip card-based security to tokenization. And this is a huge move. This will just make any chip or card-based security totally obsolete. Just let me explain this. A chip card contains a key which is used to sign transactions. That is awesome power. As long as that card is out there in circulation, it can do that as many times as you let it. That is putting, that is a lot of risk. That's relying on the security of the chip, which is very, very good. It hasn't been cracked. But relying on one chip and one key to authenticate essentially an infinite number of transactions. Tokenization is the opposite approach. Instead of having one big fruit, it's tiny slices of the fruit. Each token carries some risk, but it's a very small amount of risk. And tokens can be online managed and can be distributed on an as-needed basis. So giving a card with a lot of power to somebody who may not even need it is a lot more riskier than just handing out small electronic tokens that are only good for one transaction. Because of that change, it may happen in some markets that actually the physical chip card phase to a large degree is leapfrogged and something new is introduced. And witness, of course, what we're doing at Samsung Pay. We're exactly taking that approach. Because from a mobile phone, you can distribute tokens through the existing infrastructure, pure tokenized environment without going through the chip card phase.
Yeah, so I'm by no means an expert on the Korean financial or fintech landscape, but it strikes me as a bit odd, that question. I suspect Korea is not that far behind, and I think there's sort of maybe one key disadvantage that Korea has and many advantages. The key disadvantage is that Korea on its own is a relatively small market compared to, let's say, the United States or China or other markets. So building a big company on paper looks harder, and that's true of a lot of different countries that have small markets. I live in Switzerland. Switzerland, that's the lament of every Swiss entrepreneur is, well, I have to be instantly global because my home market is too small. But there's two mitigants to that. One is that financial services is by definition local. So it's much harder for an international competitor to come into a market, unlike we were talking about this earlier, like Facebook, if they want to go from one market to another geographically, they might have some issues. They might need to localize in terms of language, obviously, but they can do that. If you want to replicate a financial services business country by country, and existing financial institutions know this only too well, there's a whole level of complexity that goes far beyond that sort of surface level localization. So that gives domestic companies that are setting up a great opportunity to build out, and also the Samwer brothers did this very successfully in Europe with respect to e-commerce. The wonderful thing is that there's lots of innovation in the world in financial services where the underlying business model innovation or technological innovation is relevant everywhere but needs to be localized. So there's a great opportunity for entrepreneurs in Korea and elsewhere to take those ideas and build them for this market. Secondly, in terms of the advantages Korea has, is, as I mentioned, I always thought thought William Gibson was talking about Korea when he said the future is unevenly distributed. You have one of the most significantly advanced ICT infrastructures. That infrastructure in itself is important, but also your society is attuned to that, and you have a group of consumers that I think are more than ready to adopt new models of financial services that are technology enabled or technology driven. The U.S., where I'll admit that we invest globally, but we have not the majority, but almost the majority of our investments are in the U.S. There's some wonderful entrepreneurs there. There's a great entrepreneurial ecosystem. But the operating environment in the U.S. for a financial services company is probably the worst in the world. I mean, it depends on which sector of financial services. But for instance, in insurance, I'll give the example I gave of Trove earlier. It's a U.S. company based in the East Bay, an amazing company. The U.S. will be not in the top 10 first markets where it becomes ubiquitous, because navigating the insurance regulatory environment in the U.S., it's like going back to the 19th century.
Agree. This is why we have to bring foreign investors or foreign insights into the conversation, I feel, because I was expecting different answers from you. And it turns out they're also optimistic about Korea. And my last common questioner today revolves around the dynamics between the incumbents and the startups. So
so maybe I'll kick off. We actually built Anthemis. We're not a venture capital fund in a traditional sense. We built it specifically actually to deal with that problem set. I worked until I started Anthemis for 16 years in investment banking in big, large financial institutions. And we built Anthemis to help catalyze, actually act as a bit of corporate middleware, if you will, to help the large incumbents work with startups. Now, I don't know, I'm not an expert in other industries, but I suspect it's probably true in many industries, but I know deeply that in financial services, that symbiosis is absolutely powerful and required in financial services. You need to build on the shoulders of giants. If you want to build a new financial services company, you cannot build the full stack from zero to, from back end to front end as a greenfield. All these startups in financial services, they build on top of the infrastructures, whether it's payment or clearing infrastructures, and they work with large financial institutions, either directly or indirectly. But they're very, very different types of organizations, culturally, organizationally, and there's a real opportunity, but a challenge to get them to work together. So we work with large financial institutions very closely to help them understand how to work with startups and vice versa. So I think it's absolutely, it's not a nice to have, it's sort of a must have. And it's going to be, a key success factor for any ecosystem or any financial services industry around the world. The ones that are more successful, I think, both the individual companies, but also the financial services sectors are the ones where that ability to collaborate is the most developed.
That's wonderful. I'm sure Georgie has something to add from your personal experience. Yes.
Who are the incumbents and who are the startups? I don't think it's as clear as a lot of people think. For example, in payments, is Docomo a startup or an incumbent? Is Apple Pay a startup or an incumbent? So the roles change, and maybe a very large company is not an incumbent in a particular industry, but very quickly can enter that industry as a startup and grow very quickly. So what we will see is not just incumbents coming in and competing with, or startups coming in and competing with incumbents, but as technology shifts, new entrants who are incumbents somewhere else come into financial services industry, and probably we will see financial services incumbents exit.
Very fair point. We have 5 minutes left for this discussion. I'm wondering if there is any question from the floor. any brave soul? If not, oh, do you see it? Lady on the front, please.
Hi, my name is Cindy Kim. I am the head of information economy at UK Trade and Investment at British Embassy here in South Korea. And I think you sort of talked about this earlier, Sean. I think this question is to you. Despite the fact that the Korea is sort of IT, top nation in the world, it feels like the financial service industry is stagnant, and the development of fintech industry is still in the early stage due to sort of strict, regulations. Do you have any specific advice that you'd like to give to Korean government regulators?
Yeah, so I would sort of pick up on something I touched on in my presentation, and this is advice that we're giving to every regulator that will listen to us. I think there's a lot of power in building, as I said, take the startup approach to regulation, build parallel regulatory frameworks that are constrained and limited. The idea is not to create the Wild West or create different set of rules unfairly advantaging one type of business or another. The idea is to build, as these new companies emerge and their business models emerge, build a regulatory framework from the ground up around that. And this idea of a regulatory sandbox. So just to take a very simple example, let's say if you were talking about a new type of a bank, a very simple bank that takes deposits and makes loans. You could constrain that to the simplicity of the products. You could constrain it to the size of the balance sheet, and you could test it like a startup tests its products in the market before scaling them. You could test these regulatory systems, find out where they're weak, where they're strong. And I think the important insight in terms of, and why we feel very strongly about this approach from a regulatory point of view, is that the existing regulatory framework, as I said, sometimes in some countries is better or worse, but in general is quite good and robust, but enormously complex. And so if you start playing around with that, the risk is that there's enormous unintended consequences. And rightly, most regulators and politicians are very loath to start tweaking and playing with existing regulatory frameworks because they're afraid of just that, these unintended consequences or the things that they didn't think of. And I would endorse that. I think there's enormous risk in trying to adapt regulations that were built up over decades in many cases for a world that existed then and still to some extent exists today. It's much easier to start with a blank sheet of paper and start building that in parallel. And my speculative view would be is in 10 or 15 or 20 years, very organically, those sets of rules and that regulatory framework will emerge and organically replace the old set of rules. And so it's really a lean startup mindset to regulation, I guess, is what I'm advocating.
Thanks, that was great. And George, I have one last question for you. Because of the heightened attention given to the payment industry here, and you've done 2 successful exits in payment industry. So in your experience, what is the key success factor in payment?
Key factor is people have to use it.
Okay.
People have to benefit from it. And the important constituents must all see some benefit in it. That is consumers, retailers, card issuers. It's only when all 3 see benefit and derive benefit will you see a successful new payment mode or a new payment system emerge. One very important point in all this is that the one that succeeds is not always the one that's most visible. A good example is PayPal. It was not even on Visa's radar screen for the first 6 years.
I would like to thank both of you for your time and actually making this flight out to have this great conversation with us. 박수로 감사히 부탁드릴게요. 감사합니다.
네, 지금까지 대담을 진행해 주신 이지혜 파트너님과 두 분께 다시 한번 뜨거운 박수를 부탁드리겠습니다.